We coordinated a joint stakeholder submission to the United Nations Universal Periodic Review for New Zealand on behalf of 26 community organisations in Christchurch, which focused on the human rights impacts of the devastating Canterbury earthquakes of 2010 and 2011. Today we would like to present to you 4 key points from our submission. First of all, the earthquakes constituted an unprecedented natural disaster and created major challenges for New Zealand in moving forward from these earthquakes. In addressing these challenges, it is vital that New Zealand adopts a rights-based approach. Secondly, the earthquakes have exacerbated existing social inequalities in New Zealand. And thirdly, the human rights impacts of the earthquakes have demonstrated existing shortcomings in New Zealand's overall human rights framework.
The right to housing is the right probably most impacted by the earthquakes. Over 90% of houses were damaged in the quakes, and in the now more than 3 years since the quakes, there are still some major issues in terms of habitability of houses, a huge housing shortage, very steep rent increases, and pretty much really a housing crisis. Our overarching recommendation is that New Zealand should urgently amend the Bill of Rights Act to provide protection for the right to housing as a right in and of itself.
New Zealand has seen a large increase in the number of migrant workers as they come to New Zealand to help with the rebuild. However, there is no short-term framework in place to welcome these migrant workers to Christchurch and New Zealand, and there is also no long-term national strategy for coping with the increase in migrant workers and the implications for all of New Zealand as rebuild work in Christchurch comes to an end. We strongly recommend that New Zealand ratify the United Nations Conventions on the Right of Migrant Workers and their families.
Finally, we want to talk about taking a rights-based approach in the context of the rebuild. The rebuild in Christchurch is now well underway, and there are some real opportunities for enhancing human rights. First of all, Christchurch currently has the lowest unemployment rate in New Zealand, and we strongly recommend that the government ensure that employment opportunities are available to everybody. This includes refugees, people with disabilities, migrants, youth and women. And our second point in relation to the rebuild is that given the extent of rebuilding required, there's a real opportunity to make Christchurch a truly accessible city for everybody, including in particular people with disabilities.
Aotearoa New Zealand has a population of 4.4 million people. 1 million of those people are children and young people. We're a young nation. A quarter of our population is aged under 14 years. Poverty is the greatest threat to the human rights of children and young people in New Zealand. Maori and Pacifica children are twice as likely to suffer from extreme poverty and much more likely to suffer from persistent poverty. The New Zealand government must enact legislation to tackle child poverty. This must include indicators of poverty and targets to reduce poverty. The government must also report to Parliament on these targets and indicators annually. New Zealand has the 5th worst child abuse rates in all of the OECD. On average, 1 child dies here every 5 weeks. The government must commit significant new money to prevention, treatment and recovery programs for victims of child abuse. At any one time, there are 5,500 children in the care of the state in New Zealand. 2,500 of those children are in residential or non-kinship care. The frequent movement of these children risks their education and secure home life. Worst of all, most will be dumped from care before their 17th birthday, while they're still children according to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. This is a terrible failure to care for this most vulnerable group of children in New Zealand. Government policy discriminates against young employees through the starting out wage. It denies most children's rights to be heard in their own families' court cases, and it refuses to raise the age of criminal responsibility from age 10 to an internationally acceptable age. To ensure that the human rights of children and young people are not ignored, a permanent mechanism must be established for monitoring and reporting on all of New Zealand's human rights obligations. That mechanism must be at the heart of government.
As a young person intent on making the best possible contribution to my nation, I also want my nation to make the best possible contribution to me and to other children and young people. I hope the New Zealand Government will receive feedback that provides the impetus for a stronger commitment to all human rights, and especially those of young New Zealanders. It concerns me that so many children are living in homes and communities where they miss out on some of the basics. Housing is cold and damp. They have insecure food supply and poor nutrition. Healthcare and medicines aren't accessible, and chronic sickness means they don't participate in education. I think it's time for New Zealand to fully implement the UN Convention on the Rights of a Child. We would all do better if this happened.
As an agency mandated by the UN to uphold the Convention on the Rights of the Child, it is our particular responsibility to speak up for children who are not doing well in our country. The OECD reports show that our senior population are in the top 5 in terms of wealth. Our children are in the bottom 5. Innocenti report cards support this information, and these Innocenti report cards show that New Zealand children are doing poorly compared to other OECD comparisons. Part of the reason for these reports showing poor outcomes for children is that government policy is not taking a holistic approach to children. It's very small, targeted bits of work, but we need a comprehensive approach to our children and more early investment. We hope this report will help highlight this to our government.
Our key concern is that New Zealand lacks a strong domestic legal backbone to ensure the protection and fulfilment of human rights. This shortcoming impacts on many of the human rights issues that are being raised by NGOs and government alike. Despite New Zealand having signed up to many of the core treaties, there are no mechanisms to ensure that decision makers actually consider these treaties. As a consequence, much legislation has been passed with deeply concerning human rights implications. Economic, social and cultural rights are not afforded the same protections under domestic law as civil and political rights are. They are notably absent in New Zealand's keystone human rights legislation, the Bill of Rights Act. Almost a quarter of New Zealand's children live in relative poverty and face serious barriers to accessing their rights to housing, healthcare, food and education. Still, policies such as the in-work tax credit continue to be justified under New Zealand law despite having been found by the Court of Appeal to be discriminatory and harmful to children's well-being. So in conclusion, Amnesty International recommends to New Zealand the following measures to strengthen that framework. Firstly, to establish a Human Rights Select Committee to ensure that international treaty obligations are being considered during the legislative process. Secondly, to table all concluding observations from United Nations treaty bodies in Parliament. Thirdly, to amend the New Zealand Bill of Rights so as to include economic, social and cultural rights, including for children, alongside civil and political rights. And finally, to ensure that all New Zealand legislation and policies take a holistic, rights-based approach.